So on his very first day in office, within hours of his inauguration, President Joe Biden signed 17 executive orders, memorandum, and proclamations reversing Trump administration policies, which he said, or which his aides said, had caused the greatest damage to our nation. Many of those executive orders were actually surprisingly progressive, especially since most of us had really very low expectations from the guy whose greatest asset is he is not Donald Trump. And the orders covered a very wide range of issues, from COVID to DACA, to the environment, to private prisons, and more. However, none of these had anything to do with Israel and Palestine. It seemed that he had made no difference. When his aides were later asked about whether he was going to move the embassy back from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, he said he didn't have a problem with that. When his aides were asked, because he was not asked directly, whether he was going to also reverse the Trump administration's adoption of the IHRA redefinition of Semitism, and I think it's best defined as a redefinition of Semitism, he also said he didn't have a problem with that. So we see that on Palestine and Israel, he has not taken any action that would in any way reverse the great damage that the Trump administration had done. He has taken action around other issues that are, as I said, quite progressive, but nothing so far on Israel-Palestine. So, and there is a greater understanding generally about the harm done by the US Embassy move to Jerusalem, but not so much about the harm done by this IHRA redefinition of Semitism, which is why we need to actually talk to our politicians, our legislators, about why it is very, very problematic, because it is also coming up in legislative meetings. It's 8 states so far have passed it. Kentucky was the first. I'm not quite sure what the others are, but it is something that we may have to deal with here in Washington. We don't know about it yet, but it may happen. So we need to know what the IHRA redefinition of anti-Semitism is. So this is, I'm going to go why is it problematic? A discussion of some problematic examples, the impact of the redefinition of anti-Semitism, and then the alternatives. So what is the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association? The International Holocaust Remembrance Association is an alliance, an international alliance that was formed in 1988. It started in Sweden. It has a lot of European countries. It is headquartered in Germany, and the presidency changes year after year. And it's been in Germany, it's been in Sweden, it's going to go to Poland. I think next year is going to be in Italy. So the presidency rotates, but it's an international alliance. It was formed in 1988 when it saw that there was a rise in anti-Semitism in the world. IHRA experts determined that, okay, so in a meeting in 2016, we are in my second slide, the IHRA experts determined that in order to begin to address the problem of anti-Semitism, there must be clarity about it. About what anti-Semitism is. And at the meeting in 2016, they adopted what they describe as a non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism. And that is the definition that they provided and passed at the 2016 meeting, because we need clarity about anti-Semitism. And this is the definition. There's very, very little clarity in it. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish and non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Next, please. So clearly, it's not clear enough. It is so vague as to be counterproductive. It says anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, but it doesn't describe what that perception can be. It doesn't speak about discrimination. It doesn't speak about hatred, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Okay, so now we're getting a little closer, but then it can be directed toward Jewish and non-Jewish or non-Jewish individuals. So it's a very, very vague definition. And this is it. This is the definition that we have. Because it is so vague, the IHRA then went ahead and gave 11 illustrations. Next slide, please. Can I actually move the slides? No, I can't. So next, please. And I know it's a lot of text here. These are the first 4 examples that the IHRA provides. So anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may or may not, possibly, whatever, extremely vague, 11 examples. The first 4 examples, and this is how they are ordered, these are the first 4, are actually reasonable examples of anti-Semitism, calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing of, harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion, making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews, such as the power of Jews as a collective, and so on. So these are the first 4, and they actually are good examples of anti-Semitism. And for anyone reading these 4, it's like, yeah, of course, we're going to agree to that. The next 7 examples, next, please. The next 7 are examples of anti-Semitism that equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. So again, it's a lot of text, but I have highlighted that every single one of them has Israel in it. Accusing the Jewish people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust, accusing Jewish. So you see Israel, Israel, Israel. So out of 11 examples, 4 are actually examples of anti-Semitism, 7 are examples of that deal with the state of Israel. Of these 7, again, we're going to move on to the next slide. This one is particularly problematic, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. So this is very problematic on a number of levels. Okay, I'm going into my... So what's alarming about this one is that it actually equates self-determination with statehood. And it posits, there should be a comma here, and it posits the nation state as a natural, irrefutable, but also a necessary fact of social and political life, rather than a relatively recent artificial political construct. To say that, but also I want to move on to the next slide. It is countered by the next example within the 11 examples, within the 7 that deal with Israel, applying double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. And basically, here we are. So we cannot criticize Israel, and we cannot demand of Israel anything that we don't demand of other countries. But what we are requiring of Israel is basically the behavior expected or demanded of every other democratic nation. We are not demanding of Israel, things that we would not demand of any country that claims to be a democracy. So criticizing Israel, as we saw in the previous slide, as a racist endeavor in no way singles out Israel, but it rather puts it on an equal footing with other countries that we criticize. We do say the US is a racist endeavor. We do say Canada is a racist endeavor. We do say, for example, that the US is a country. Everybody acknowledges that. I mean, when we start with a land acknowledgement, we acknowledge the fact that the US is founded on the dispossession and the genocide of the indigenous people. We know that the US was built through 400 years of slave labor, and that racism continues to be at the core of this country. And so if we say that about the US, we can say that the US is a racist endeavor, but we cannot say that about Israel. So actually what the IHRA definition wants to do is exempt Israel from the kind of criticism that we can make of any other country. So this is where I actually said that, because I've been personally wrangling with this progressive except Palestine, and I actually think that it is incorrect to speak of progressive except for Palestine. We should be speaking of progressive except for Zionism. It is Zionism that is being exempt from the ideas of progressive. So So anyway, that is one of that's a couple of the problematic uh, problematics aspects. Can we move on to know what else I'm going to be talking about? Okay. The impact of this definition, which has 7 out of 11 examples, and as I said, it's too much text and it is available everywhere, so please look it up. The impact of this is that by exempting Israel from criticism, it actually does not combat discrimination against Jews. It criminalizes activism for justice for Palestinians. And that's really important. It is not, there are enough definitions of anti-Semitism that describe anti-Semitism for what it is. What IHRA does by redefining anti-Semitism and putting 7 examples of anti-Semitism as criticism of Israel is it actually criminalizes activism for justice for Palestinians. And by painting Palestinian resistance as anti-Semitic, it posits support for Israel as the moral high ground. So next slide, please. This is actually really important because the strategic context of this redefinition is critical. Politically and militarily, Palestinians are weaker, are significantly, way, way, way weaker than the Israelis. Everybody knows that, right? The only advantage that Palestinians hold is the justness of our cause and struggle. People are joining us because of the moral basis of this struggle. It is what connects many people around the world to the Palestinian cause, for example, through the BDS campaign. So by portraying this cause as anti-Semitic, it takes away from the cause its greatest strength, which is its justness, by making it an anti-Semitic cause, an anti-Semitic struggle. So that's why we need to actually counter the definition, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, because it is one that does not protect Jews against anti-Semitism in any way that is not already there, because it's not the first definition of anti-Semitism. But what it does bring to the plate is that it criminalizes Palestinian resistance, it criminalizes activism for Palestine, and it takes away the moral high ground that Palestinians have as a just cause, which is the one card we have against Israel. It has the politics, it has the military, it has the weapons, it has the vaccines. What we have is the cause, and it's taking that away from us. Do I have another slide? Okay, so the alternative, there's one new alternative that came up literally days ago. It's called the Jerusalem Declaration. Oh, I didn't know that I thought maybe I could possibly click on that. The Jerusalem Declaration came up only 2 days ago as an alternative. It's signed by 200, 2 minutes left. Okay, that's a direct message to me, 2 minutes left. I think I can do that. All right. So the alternative is the Jerusalem Declaration, which was published only 2 days ago. It's got a couple, 200 signatures and so on. And it actually has a definition that makes sense. Anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews or Jewish institutions as Jewish. Right? It's so much more concrete and clear than the IHRA definition, which is a certain perception of Jews which may express itself as hatred and may be directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish people. Here we have a real definition. However, and with that definition, there are 15 guidelines, and think of the guidelines again. I thought that we would be able to click on that. No big deal. 15 guidelines, just like the IHRA definition comes with 11 examples. The Jerusalem Declaration includes 15 guidelines, some of which are very specific about criticism of Zionism and support for BDS are not anti-Semitic. So it's actually a good alternative. It's one that if we were to talk to our legislators, we would say, if you want to sign on to anything, sign on to the Jerusalem Declaration, because it explains anti-Semitism and it says criticism of Zionism and support for BDS are not anti-Semitic. I still have problems with it, and I'm not the only one having problems with it. It totally erases non-Jewish Semites. I mean, that's something that all of us Arabs are like, we are Semitic. How do you define Semitic? Why are we erased? Why are we invisibilized? But that's a little bit besides the point here, even though it's aggravating. It is still very much focused on Israel. Thus, by focusing on Israel, because a lot of actually guidelines 6 through 11, through 15, so like even more guidelines, even more numerically, even more than the IHRA, are focused on Israel. And this reinforces the association of Palestinian struggle with anti-Jewish racism or with anti-Semitism. If every time you have to discuss anti-Semitism, you have to say the Palestinians are not anti-Semitic, you are reinforcing that. And so when the majority of the examples are somewhat protective of Palestinians, it's like, why is it that, I mean, why? Why even bring it up, time? And it still has no Palestinian perspective. And that's the end of my presentation on the IHRA and the end of my time. Oh, yes, I just let this one last slide by Dima Khalidi of Palestine Legal. The Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism rightly intends to ameliorate the harm that IHRA's promoters have done in equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism to censor political speech, but the new definition risks reinforcing the impulse to decide for Palestinians and their allies what is acceptable to say about Israel and Palestinians' lived experiences.